Please welcome back to the stage Matthew Swift and Lieutenant General Christopher Cavoli, Commanding General of the United States Army Europe.
Lieutenant General, thank you so much for joining us for the 8th Concordia Annual Summit.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, did you just come in last night?
As you can see from my blinking, yes. Yeah, I came in last night from Frankfurt and spent the morning talking at a couple of different venues in town, and
Right.
Very excited to be here. What a beautiful summit you put on. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. So I want to talk specifically about what has happened since the Cold War and the United States' strategic interest in Europe. And frankly, and forgive sort of the very basic question, but I want you to, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about exactly what we are doing in Europe militarily today.
Okay. First, a little bit of organization. The U.S. Department of Defense divides the world up into chunks and assigns commanders to manage military affairs in those locations. There's the Pacific Command, there's Southern Command, of course there's European Command. So the commander of European Command is General Scaparrotti, and he has two jobs. The first job is to be the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO's field forces, and the second is to be in charge of the U.S. forces in Europe. As such, he has a naval component, an Air Force component, an Army component. I command the Army component, so the U.S. Army in Europe. Got about 35,000 soldiers, both permanently stationed and rotational, spread across bases, about 89 different installations in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Kosovo, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Latvia, and Hungary. So spread around quite a bit. Our job, and the job of U.S. EUCOM, is to be ready to conduct whatever operations the United States requires of us, in the main as part of the NATO alliance. So my job specifically is to provide trained and ready forces to General Scaparrotti, should he need to use them, and to do so in a context with our allies, any place throughout Europe or parts of the Middle East.
So our focus has expanded, but as I understand it, the force has decreased. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So coming through the Cold War, the bulk of the U.S. Army was located in Europe. We had north of 270,000 U.S. soldiers stationed principally in Germany during the Cold War. And at the end of the Cold War in the 90s, obviously that became no longer imperative, and we began a drawdown. The drawdown paused a little bit in the 90s when we were involved in the peacekeeping and stabilization missions in the Balkans, which in the beginning used large numbers of soldiers, and those were under U.S. Army Europe Command and European Command. As we came into the 2000s, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq came up, and we began to draw forces down more rapidly. We hit a low point probably in about 2013 or 2014. We had about 25,000 Army soldiers. And then, well, frankly, things started to change on the continent. I think the incursion into Georgia in 2008 was a big wake-up call in Europe. Again in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the incursion into eastern Ukraine. And our allies, and we realized that we had to build some force structure back up. And so we've been selectively adding some soldiers.
Over the last few years?
Over the last few years, since about 2014, we have been adding selected soldiers specifically designed to be able to scale up for larger operations and down for smaller operations. This has largely been funded in the U.S. case by something called the European Deterrence Initiative, which is an initiative of the U.S. Congress. And this year alone provides $6.3 billion in supplementary funding for conducting activities that reassure our allies and that deter potential adversaries throughout Europe.
Well, so given your position, I have to ask, Russia, friend or foe?
Well, the U.S. National Defense Strategy brings a couple of new thoughts into our strategic conversation this year. So the National Security Strategy and the National Defense Strategy lay out a world in which great power competition has returned. And those documents specify that China and Russia are competitors in this space, and we need to be prepared to compete both short of armed conflict and if necessary, in armed conflict. So we don't really say friend or foe. We say it's they're in a position of competing with us right now.
And can you talk then, can you elaborate a little bit on the current security environment you're operating in? You cited Georgia, you cited Crimea. Can you describe more broadly the security environment you're working in today?
Well, the first and most important thing is to recognize that I presume, the way your question followed, that you're starting from a perspective of where does Russia fit in. I think the first and most important thing to recognize is that Europe is not a one-problem continent, and my command is not a one-problem command. There are many challenges out there. In U.S. Army Europe's area of responsibility, there are three principal challenges. One is deterring great power competition, to deter Russia, and to assure our allies that we are there with them, shoulder to shoulder, in a competent, credible, combat-ready way. The second is to assist other agencies combating terrorism across the continent, and with our allies combating terrorism, which continues to be a problem throughout the world. And the third, a little-known fact, is that the European area of responsibility includes Israel. And so the third is to ensure the defense of Israel.
So getting a little bit more specific, though, when you talk about the role of our forces as it relates to counterterrorism, Paris, for instance, what role are we playing in terms of a response?
Sure. So one of the principal roles we play is to assist in the passage of information back and forth. One of the great advances since 9/11, I believe, has been the increased transparency across the U.S. government, agency to agency, with regard to information, security information. And hand in glove with that goes a great reduction in obstacles to passing information from country to country. So the first thing we do is pass information back and forth with them. In addition to that, we have sometimes provided material support when it's required. I think the main effect, though, using France as an example, the French armed forces are required to field active duty soldiers onto French streets, as you know, under Operation Sentinelle. And this weighs on their force structure and is a requirement that then competes with other things, such as interacting with us on a tactical basis.
So I want to nail down on this a little bit more. In terms of force readiness, in terms of force projection, give a letter grade. How do you feel we are doing? How should the audience here feel? Positive?
The audience should feel very positive. The U.S. military is ready to counter any problems we run into. We are very well funded. We are funded at $717 billion as a Department of Defense this year, which is the highest we have ever received. The Army has a very large budget this year. I have the supplemental that we discussed earlier. These things directly purchase readiness. They purchase readiness for force projection, and they purchase the combat readiness of the force. It's up to me and guys like me to turn that money into actual results. And that's what we spend our time doing. We do a great number of exercises that practice and rehearse the mechanisms necessary to deploy forces to Europe and around Europe, more importantly around Europe, and to go from a standing start into simulated combat operations. This is what we spend our time and resources doing. In that regard, we typically attempt to make large-scale cross-border movements on the continent. because those challenge some of our procedures and some of our infrastructure and show us the things we need to work on to get even smoother. But I would never want to give myself a grade. My mom's always had that role in my house. But I would say we should be very confident in the US military and NATO's ability to move around the continent and conduct operations.
We've been in Germany since World War II. We've been in Kosovo since the 90s. You've talked a little bit about our expansion into other countries as well. Do you see, I mean, is this a permanent presence for us?
Well, it's a rotational presence for a reason. It's a rotational presence because it gives us the agility to move the force where it needs to be. There's always a balance between how much infrastructure you lay down to be able to be efficient and effective, and how little infrastructure you use, which leads to agility. I think we've got a really good balance right now. We have an armored brigade combat team that's about a 4,000 soldier, tank-heavy armored formation. That's mostly located in Poland right now. We have a division headquarters located in Poland, so a general officer headquarters located in Poland. We have a combat aviation brigade, which is about 120 helicopters located in Poland. And these forces spread around some of the other rotational areas that I talked about. You know, when we consider the question permanent location versus rotational location, it's important to remember that the challenges we might face are unpredictable geographically and temporally. That is, we don't know when or where necessarily they'd occur. So my force has to be set for agility. It has to be set to be able to move quickly to what is now an undefined point of potential conflict, to be able to get there early enough to deter, and if not, strong enough to win.
Now, I know you can't, and you're not going to talk about, you know, politics in any way, but I want to touch on how you define a good partner. How do you define a good country as a partner to what you are doing?
That's a very thoughtful question, actually. The first step on a military level to being a good partner is to have a willingness to engage in a mutually beneficial and respectful fashion in a process of solving hard military problems together. So that's what the exercise program I was just describing does. We pose for ourselves hard military problems. How do I move this group from here to here? How do I get this group here in this amount of time? And it requires us all to work together on it. That provides a rich professional dialogue and problem-solving opportunity that leads to stronger relationships. The stronger relationships is what creates a good partner or a good ally. When you have strong relationships that are backed up by capability and a common mentality, those are really the biggest strengths.
How are you doing in terms of technological advancements? Are you able to adapt as quickly as you want to? New technology?
Yeah, so I don't think anybody in the world in any field right now would say that he's feeling like he can adapt as quickly as he wants to. However, we have some good methods in place for adapting quickly. We look in terms of adapting our procedures, our technology, and our mentality. So whether it's changing our doctrine or our methodologies or our equipment, I think we have some pretty good built-in programs or built-in evolutionary systems. The thing people focus on mostly tends to be technology and tends to be equipment. How quickly can we get it going? The U.S. Army right now is engaged in a very big overhaul of the way we research, develop, and acquire new equipment. We've created a new command solely dedicated to Army futures, a couple of other things. But really, that's not the hardest thing. The hardest thing is really moving mentality fast enough, changing our collective understanding of the nature of warfare fast enough to be able to keep up with the challenges we see. So that's what I spend my time on a lot. Exercises, professional development, education of my officers and my NCOs.
That's great. Well, listen, thank you. You've come a long way. Really appreciate you joining us at Concordia. And the military is a model for the public-private partnership model that we talk about. So it's always important that we have you all at the table, and we're grateful for that. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, Matthew.